Are you exhausted from carrying it all and realizing something has to change? What if 4 days could give you the clarity and breakthrough that normally takes 6 months of counseling? The Soul Care Intensive program is open to anyone ready to do deep, focused work. In just 4 days, you'll complete comprehensive assessments, receive 8 hours of therapy, a follow-up report of the sessions, tools, and aftercare options, all in a distraction-free environment built for real change. This experience is especially powerful for couples working through marital strain, communication breakdowns, or years of unresolved tension. If you're tired of surviving and ready to get unstuck, don't wait. Check out emerge.org/intensives today. A Soul Care Intensive is for you when waiting is no longer working, because staying the same is no longer an option.
It's the XM Podcast with licensed mental health therapist Matthew Kanabe.
Well, today's conversation is one of those that hits close to home for so many people, but doesn't get talked about nearly enough. What do you do when your child grows up and walks away from their values, your faith, your hopes for their life, when they're no longer under your roof making their own decisions and you're left navigating the tensions between love, truth, boundaries, and letting go? For parents of prodigals, especially adult children, there's a deep ache, a quiet grief, and a lot of unanswered questions. And the reality is, there just aren't many resources or spaces that speak directly into this season of parenting. That's why I'm really grateful for today's guest. She brings both compassion and clarity to this conversation. We're going to talk honestly about the fears parents carry, the mistakes we worry we've made, the boundaries we struggle to hold, and how to stay grounded in faith and hope, even when the story isn't unfolding the way we imagined. If you've ever found yourself lying awake at night wondering if your child will come back, or if you've wrestled with how to love well without enabling, or if you felt alone on this journey, this conversation is going to be for you. Please welcome to the show my guest, Lori Ross.
Yeah, you and I had a conversation several months ago, and I'm really grateful for the timing. I'm interested in having this conversation because we're going to be talking a lot about parenting. And I do have a podcast coming up from a clinical perspective on parenting. So this is the timing, God's timing is always perfect. And I love having a conversation of people who are experiencing these things and then following that up with a clinical conversation. But before we get into our topic today, Lori, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and who you are to our audience?
Sure. My name is Lori Ross. I am married. I've been married for 24 years. I'm stopping because I actually lied. It's been 26 years.
We have keep those 2 years. That's
We have 3 boys. They are 20 to 25 years old. All of them, I am officially empty nester. I have one that is working and living in out of state, and I have 2 that are in state in college. One is about to graduate, the other one's middle of the way through. I was born and raised in a Christian home. My husband was not. Very miraculous way in which God brought us together and brought my husband to know Jesus, and then raised our children in a Christian home for all those years. And I think that's how I met you, was through starting counseling with Emerge, primarily talking with Claire, who's my counselor, just the struggles of kind of having this responsibility of raising your children in all the things. So like, you're telling them when to eat, you're telling them when to do their homework, and it's Sunday morning, you get up and you go to church, and then they go off to school and they start making their own decisions, and having to navigate them making decisions that you don't necessarily approve of or are happy about, and how do you wrestle with that? And I was not prepared for that as an adult. I think it happened so quickly and wasn't prepared for that. And so been so thankful for Emerge and Claire and helping me navigate that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Claire's great, and so grateful that you were able to connect with her, and she's just really done some great work with Emerge. Can you share a little bit about, like, you've got adult children now, but as they were growing, you and I kind of talked about, I mean, culture has really changed since I was in school, since you were in school. And what were some of the things that maybe you noticed that were challenging as a parent that maybe some parents today are wrestling with? What were some of the things as your boys were growing up going, oh man, I wasn't thinking about that, or that's something that, I know it's a generalized question, but just kind of wanted to get your perspective of, maybe some of the things that you noticed as they were growing up.
Sure. I think one of the big things, I'm 57 and was raised obviously without internet
Yeah.
and was raised in an environment where I had wonderful Christian parents, but there it was do what I say, and that's the way it goes. There wasn't really necessarily an explanation of like, this is why we do this. This is why we don't do this. It's just, you don't do it. We weren't, that culture when I was growing up was not very communicative. So we didn't, things that were prickly or things that were difficult, you didn't discuss. And one of my first recollections, so then once I had my boys, the culture kind of started to say the way we were raised was wrong. So now we need to be communicating. We need to be in our kids' faces. We need to be having all these conversations. And one of the first ones I remember is the Penn State controversy that happened with the athletics. And my middle son was very involved in athletics, and it was all over ESPN. And I remember like having to because in my brain it was like I have to have these conversations, so kind of feeling this pressure to have these difficult conversations. And kind of what I've talked about with Claire is that we were doing our best, but we had nothing to go on. Like we didn't have that modeled for us, so trying to have difficult conversations with our kids was not natural I think for a lot of us as parents. So that was one big piece. So I'm sure we fumbled around a lot with that process. The second thing was the pressure with social media. And it certainly parents are experiencing it now, but I think the society now is at least aware that it is a problem. So they're starting to kind of go, hey, we need to put some guardrails. We had no idea. And I remember sitting in a small group with a youth minister telling us, whatever app I'm going to tell you about right now, this is past because they're already developing the next one. So no matter what you think you're going to find out about TikTok or this or that, there's going to be 4 more that are out before you even get your hands around this one. And it was absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really accurate. I think several years ago we were in the wild, wild west of apps and social media. I think without moving the conversation in a different direction, I think we're in the wild, wild west of AI now. There's always something coming. I remember the internet being introduced, and it was like, what is this crazy thing? It's as a high school student, and as we progress, these things progress more quickly and more quickly, and there's a lot more resources out currently. There's a lot more books that have been written, a lot more trainings that have been done, a lot more education around social media. So I do think we're in a different phase. And that makes a lot of sense. Whereas, I think the AI thing is kind of like the same thing of maybe where we were 10, 15 years ago in the social media realm. As comfortable as you are, Lori, to share, just talk a little bit about some of the parenting challenges, and maybe as best we can talk about where you're at today and why we would even be having this conversation.
Yeah, so I think and I'm not going to steal this. I'm going to give her credit. Mary DeMuth is an author. She has a lot of books. I've most recently read her book Love, Pray, Listen, and it's about parenting. And the way she talks about it, she says, my children are still writing their testimony. And I love that, because I think as a parent, watching your kids make decisions that you wouldn't necessarily agree with is difficult, because you've been kind of spent 18 years sort of directing their decisions. So, especially where it falls in the way of spiritual realm. So, we try to be very intentional with our kids, and we're going to help host small group. We're going to host quote unquote missionaries that come into our home. So you're interacting, and they didn't have a choice. It was kind of like, this is what we're doing, and they were part of it. And so you just sort of assume that they were down with that kind of way of life. And then when they move on to their own choices, and you're talking to them, and maybe you're hearing like, it's, in your conversations with your kids, going to church is not a priority, or small groups are not a priority. And knowing how to navigate that, and not trying to fix it. Because as a parent, I think that's what you're sort of trained to do, right? You want to help your kids. You want to teach them basics. You want to help them avoid pain. And then all of a sudden they're making these decisions. And how do you, you're kind of this in between. You're not a complete parent, but they're not completely independent. And so I give the example, and all my kids have given me approval to have this conversation. But like, you come home for summer break and we're going to church, but they're not up. And are you going to wake them up and wait for them to stagger up and go to church 10 minutes late? Are we going to just tell them the night before, this is when we're going? And what's funny, I've had conversations with many of my friends who've all experienced this. And like, we change it. Like, one summer we do this, and then the next summer we do that, and not really knowing what is the right course, what is the right thing to do. And feeling very kind of alone in that decision. And that's a very small example, but it's a very real example of that struggle of when, 6 months before, they just were up and they were going. And then now they spend a semester at school, and now they're home and making their own decisions. And so that's been kind of where I've relied on Claire a lot, is just to like, what's the right thing to say? And how do I not sound super judgy? And I want them to be there, but do I want them to be there if they feel obligated to be there? That type of thing. That was kind of a long-winded answer, but
No, I think it's a very valid question, and I think it's something that a lot of parents have to deal with, is that life transition of, are they under my authority in the same way that they were when they were in high school? And that's a very I mean, I've done over the years so much counseling of the close to empty nesting or empty nesting, because your role changes, and it's very difficult, especially if you have multiple kids. You add 18 plus however many kids you have, and all of a sudden there's a lot of time there, and we're trying to redefine. At the same time, I think what's important that you said, and I've shared this on the podcast before, I grew up in a strong Christian home, that I think it was in my early 20s, I really rebelled against the idea of my parents' faith and had to find it for myself. And it was a very challenging time. But I think that the idea of what you just said is going, am I making them go, or are they wanting to go? Because it's a big difference. And I think that's a really hard thing, because I think a lot of parents will draw the line And the problem is what then does that make the child or the young adults feel about faith? Does that turn a disdain because they're being forced to do something they don't want? And it is. It's a valid question. As you've been navigating that, excuse me, as you've been navigating that, what have you found successful, and how have you and your husband decided as best you can to handle those situations? I know, like, Sunday mornings going to church would be one. I'm sure there's multiple other things that are included in that, but what have you found, if any, that have been working for you?
We'll be right back.
LPC, LPCC, IMFT, LISW, PhD. If you don't know what any of those are, go ahead and hit the 30-second fast forward button and enjoy the podcast. But if you know someone or happen to have those credentials, then Emerge might be your next career path. If you're seeking to join a team that provides authentic Christian counseling and utilizes advanced modalities, then apply today at emerge.org/careers and join us in the battle to help people find freedom and rest.
I think the two of us have and to give my husband credit, he was on board with this way sooner than I was. I think I wanted to fix things, and so I was much more feeling like I had to be intentional about those kind of things. And my husband was much more like, hey, like, let them decide, and we can't force them to do these kind of things. And I think recognizing that God loves them more than I could ever hope to. And I had somebody ask me once about how did they put it? Like, did other people help shape your Christianity besides your parents? And I said, absolutely. And they said, well, why do you think that's not the case for your kids? And that was so comforting, because I thought, okay, I can't do this. Like, I'm not going to be their salvation. That has to come from Christ. And I don't want them to have my faith. I want their faith to be their own. But what I struggled with was, I do realize that the parents' influence on their kids is one of the biggest influences for whatever, anything. And so then I felt a lot of guilt and pressure to say, well, what is the expectation for me? In other words, if I don't ask my kids and say, I really want you to go to church, they're missing on this opportunity. And is that what God's asking of me? I grew up kind of in a more legalistic background, so it's very hard for me I've always felt that way, like very kind of, not rules based, but like, if I don't do this, it's a sin of omission, like God's counting on me. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so that has taken me counseling and years to go, you know what? I'm not going to ask them. Like, I'm going to tell them every day or every weekend, Dad and I are going. And now, I mean, the last time they were home, they know we go to church, and I don't even say we're going to the 9:00 service. We're going to church. And if they want to go, then they can ask us what time we're going, and we'll be there. Mm-hmm. And so it honestly kind of has released the burden a little bit, because I realized that I'm not saving them, but I don't, I still struggle with not knowing where they're at in their faith and having to trust. And that's very, very difficult, I think. Yeah. And I would say, back to the social media piece, there's social media for us as parents and adults too. And so seeing those posts of your friends and your, acquaintances across the country where oh, my son Jim is a youth pastor at such and so church, and my daughter Susie, you know, as her and her husband are missionaries in this place, or those kind of feelings, and getting that sense of like, is this my fault as parents? Is this our fault? Where did we go wrong in not our kids not feeling that that was a priority? And that's really, really difficult. And one things I will say, Mary DeMuth said, and this has really been helped shape kind of the past year, where she's saying she's interacted with other parents that are in our space, that the parents are so crippled by that feeling of guilt that basically Satan has won twice. So where you may perceive that your kids aren't walking in their faith, the parent is so distraught by that that Satan's winning in their life in terms of them not being able to serve, to not be able to get out of that cycle of depression or guilt, to serve and be a light for Jesus. And that was very convicting to me.
Yeah, that kind of leads me into my next kind of question, which I think is tough. And I really appreciate your ability to be transparent through this and sharing difficult things of, parenting is hard. It is. There's no question it is difficult. And I think there's going to be people listening, Lori, that identify. I know it. There's no question in my mind that people who are listening are going, you know what? I don't know Lori's situation, but I know what she's talking about. I do think guilt and shame play a big part in this. And I do think that there is a cultural credibility for parents when your children are doing well. Does that make sense? Okay. So
yes,
I'm resonating with you. I feel that I know, it's almost as if it reflects on our success of the way our children. So how have you been handling that? How do you deal with it? How do you not deal with it? I think that's one of the most difficult things, starting really early on, and even, first grade, second grade, and they bring home a spelling test and they don't do well on it. It's like, oh, what am I doing wrong? Like, am I ruining this kid? And it's like, but there's so much about performance-based ideology. And then you get into that phase, the phase that you're in when you're launching your children out into the world. And man, it is a reflection upon you. Is that a fair assessment?
100%. And I mean, to the extent that when my kids started making decisions that I didn't necessarily agree with, I resonated with what Mary said about this other parent, where I became isolated because it was so vulnerable to think, who am I going to share this with? And are they going to judge me? And I have a very dear, my best friend growing up, and was able to discuss with her some of the decisions and things that my kids were doing. And there was no judgment. And probably 2 years into that kind of phase in my life, I was able to reach out to some women that I had been in a small group. And it was funny because these were women, there were 8 of us that were in a small group when our kids were little. And, what are you doing for potty training? And what are you doing for this? And life got in the way, and a couple of families moved away. And I said, I need to reach out to these women. And I was absolutely terrified. I asked them if they wanted to meet regularly to pray for our kids. And, I knew I had to be open and vulnerable, and shared where my kids were, and was petrified of the response. And I'm going to cry, but they showed me nothing but love and care. And I would say, from the outside looking in, those, if you were on the social media posts looking, their kids are doing everything like textbook, you know what I mean? And the fact that they didn't try to judge me. They didn't, try to say, well, do this and you should do that. Just sat and offered love and grace and prayer. Um, I've told them repeatedly, like, how impactful that was. And I've talked to other people in my space who didn't have that experience and how absolutely devastating it was. So when they went to share with their confidence was met with either judgment or just a bunch of suggestions of like, well, I think you should do this and I think you should do that. And so that's something else I would say is that that is so, so important, that we support each other, even if we're not walking that same path with our kid, because I think you never know, we never know what's right around the corner. So like,
Sure.
you may feel like things are going really good with my child, but 6 months from now, it might not be. And so having that support and being caring and compassionate is like, that meant so much to me. And that really started my true healing, I think, and dealing with this and being more comfortable with being vulnerable and not lifting some of that guilt and shame. Their response helped me realize, like, it's not you cannot take this on your own.
I'm so grateful that you had that community, because it's so important. When you're going through adversity, when you're going through crisis, it's how you're received in that will determine how you navigate it. And I think the thing, Lori, from my perspective, everybody's story is different. And I think we get so locked into a comparison, and we all do it. I'm guilty as anybody. I'm not sitting on this podcast acting like I'm any different. But I just think it's like, well, why isn't my kid at this developmental level? Or why isn't my kid, doing this? Or why isn't my kid being, what's the word I'm looking for? Like this college looking for this kid or whatever it may be. And the problem with that, and especially when you move it into the spiritual aspect and their faith journey, what if God's building a story that he wants to utilize later? I've met so many people that their testimony, when they share it, it is so moving. But if God didn't have them endure whatever it was that they had to overcome, my guess would be, and this is a hypothetical, but if I went back before whatever that adversity was and asked that person's parents, do you want this person to go through this? They would say, no, of course I don't. Of course I don't. But then God will utilize it. I mean, this podcast, just in itself, I've been able to interview so many people that have been through so many things that I'm like, my goodness, but it's their story and their ability to overcome adversity through the power of Jesus that all of a sudden they're able to make an impact that is not just localized, it's kingdom building. And so I for years I have been talking about the comparison thief, because your children's story are different than my children's story, and your story is different than my story. And I think a lot of times I'll work therapeutically with young people in their 20s, and they want all of it at once. They want the job, they want the career, they want the wife, and all of these things. I'm like, what would life be if you just received the whole thing in that moment? Like, well, my buddy got that. It's like, well, why are you comparing? But we do it. It's just who we are as human beings. You can see it all the way back in Genesis. Like it happened with the first siblings. It's like we are constantly in comparison. Lori, I'd like to talk a little bit, and I want to do this in a uplifting, positive way. But I would like to talk about the church. This is not, I don't want people to listen and go, oh, he's going to bash the church. It's not what I'm doing. But I would like to talk about your experience navigating life, resources with the church or the lack thereof, and what you and your husband have kind of experienced, and hopefully opening an eye or giving maybe a perspective that's maybe not being noticed as much as it should be.
Yeah. I, and this is my same thing. And when I say the church, I mean, like, because I have interacted and I have friends all over the country in different parts of my state all over that are kind of navigating the same thing. And I'm not saying it's wrong because I know that they're, I think of like the church as we have enough like resources that there are, I don't want to say trends, but there's ways that I think the church has figured out like this is a better time to for in people's lives. So regardless of I think the idea is that young families are a great target. And I'm sure that there is research to back that up. That's what I'm trying to say. But what I found is that in that space, it has left my demographic out. And I say that because we've recently changed churches. We really felt God calling us to move on. And when we were looking, of course, everything's online now, just looking for that kind of support, it's not there. I think so. So you see a lot of like some, women's Bible studies, men's Bible studies, social events, small groups or community groups, life groups. Those are great. But what I find is a lot of places, and we had this experience where for a long time, I felt the focus was on diversity in all manner. So it doesn't mean just ethnically diverse, but we want people who are 20 and we want people who are 80 and we want to bring all these people together. And being in those settings, when my husband and I were navigating this, it was kind of, I don't know, that's too strong of a word, but it was frustrating because we felt like we couldn't really be vulnerable and share because at the time you're like, half these people aren't at that stage, or half these people are so far removed from that stage that, they can't relate. And I think the church is really missing out on supporting this. And I would say that I know that every generation probably thinks this is the hardest parenting generation. I mean, I don't know that that's true, but I do know, like I said, social media, we know, is something that we have never experienced before. So when you think of the influences that your children have are far greater than they ever had before in all that entails, whether it's sexual identity, whether it is your influence in terms of what is acceptable, socially not acceptable. Those influences are so strong. And I think that the pressure on parents to know how to navigate that and handle those kind of conversations is crippling. And I think before we talked about of guilt and shame, and if you don't have an outlet, if you're not comfortable with counseling, if you don't have a resource to confide in, Satan wins twice, right? So if you're a parent and your child is LGBTQ, and you decide like I can't confide in anybody about this, I don't know where to turn, and then maybe you turn away from the church. And that is my biggest concern, is that these steps they're really, 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 really hard. And if you don't have a support system, it's devastating. And I've talked to Claire about this, I think, and that's why I have always been a big advocate of counseling, and very open. I've always been open to my kids about it. But I think not all of us are gifted like you in your space are. And so when Claire will say, well, why don't you say this? Or have you thought about that? I'll be like, no, I have never thought about that because my brain doesn't work that way. Yeah. And I think then leaving parents to their own devices can create big division with parent, child, husband and wife. And just expecting parents to navigate that on their own, I think we're missing out on a way to minister to people. And if nothing else, it doesn't necessarily change the trajectory your grown child is on, but it can certainly help the relationship that's there, because so many people in my space have had conversations with their adult children about something that they're doing, and it creates animosity. It creates um, estrangement from those relationships. And I just feel like having that support from the church would be so, so helpful.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear a little bit from your perspective and maybe your husband's. What would a ministry kind of look like if there's a church listening, if there's a pastor listening and feeling drawn or feeling a Holy Spirit nudge, what would have been helpful for you guys within the church concept? I guess I'm trying to understand, is that a parenting group? Like, what do you think would be most beneficial for parents like yourself and what you guys have been going through?
Yeah, and one thing I would say is that I'm old school, obviously, and back in the day, like from when I was a kid and from a young adult, we had good old Sunday school. And Sunday school back in the day, at least in my experience, was very structured based on like your demographic. It would be like um, youth broken up by grades, or it'd be a singles class, or it'd be young marrieds, and then the older class. And when we first started as a married couple going to church, we had a Sunday school class of people our demographic, and it was amazing. It was where we kind of connected with people, and you started making those smaller group connections through that. But that's where I feel like some of these things, like even to go into a small group, if a family's dealing with a really, really difficult issue, they may not feel comfortable in that space, especially if they're not in the same demographic. So to your point, yes, a parenting class would be wonderful. But acknowledging, I think, like I said, I think we've somehow gotten away from the fact that, or felt like people meeting that are in the same demographic is somehow a bad thing for some reason. I don't know why. Um, and I think, man, we're really missing out, because in discussions with my friends who are walking the same journey, they will describe something with their child, and I will hear that and go, man, that's a really good point. I never thought about that. And so I think going back to even a class where demographics are the same, where people don't necessarily have to feel like they're on the spot in a small group to say, I'm going to be vulnerable and share this really, sensitive subject about my kids. But if you're in a larger group where communication's happening, that is, to me, is something that we're really missing. And acknowledging that not everybody's comfortable sharing in a large group or a small group, but hearing and engaging with people that are is so helpful. And then from there, maybe then you have smaller connections. So two people can kind of have a side conversation if they hear somebody talking about that same issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. That's the model for therapeutic group work. You get people who are going through similar life circumstances. That's where AA is born out of. You have people who have similarities. They're not the same stories, but there's similarities within the context of why we do group work. We'll do parenting groups, and usually those are parents who are looking for some direction because of parenting issues. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's important just because I wanted our listeners to kind of hear what would be beneficial. I know I work with a ton of churches. I'm very involved in our church, and I get churches can't be all things. You can't have a ministry for everybody's circumstance, and I understand that. But I also think, as the body, as the church at large, and this is the large C, church, well, if this church is doing addiction, maybe this church does divorce care and this church does parenting. There's ways that we can work together, because I get it. I work with a ton of pastors and they're like, I don't have the resources to run 50 ministries. I get it. Totally get it.
Mhm.
But if we focus over here on this and we can partner with this church down the street, and I talk to a lot of pastors about those types of things, of going, how can we serve these unique groups that need ministry?
Mhm.
But if we are all doing, I don't know, singles ministries, well, that's kind of redundant,
Yeah.
and I think that's kind of speaking into what you were sharing. Lori, is there anything else you'd like to share as our time kind of winds down? Anything else on your heart, or you would like to share with our audience?
I think that I would just encourage people that if they're navigating this and they feel like they're alone, they're not alone. And I would encourage you to reach out to a trusted friend and don't feel like you have to navigate this alone. When I look back at when I was really struggling, it was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. And I am very comfortable with counseling, but I keep going back to thinking, if I was going through what I've gone through and didn't have that, didn't feel comfortable. So, I mean, the one thing I would say is do not be afraid of counseling. It has been so beneficial to me. And if you truly feel like you can't confide or you don't know who to confide in, then counseling is even more important. And I cannot stress that enough. I try to be so open. I'm actually a physical therapist by trade, and I work in adolescent sports. And I am with my kids. I've always been like, yes, I'm going for counseling. My counselor this, my counselor that. So it just sounds like anything I would do. I'm going to Burger King and then I'm going to see Claire, my counselor.
That's good.
That's how you have to normalize it. And I think it is so beneficial. But I think it's especially with these kind of issues, because I truly feel that I am not equipped to communicate effectively with my own children. And I will just say that I don't know if that's my personality, maybe because I have 3 boys. But I think that was another area of guilt and shame, that I felt like I should have all the answers in terms of how to talk to them. And then I just realized, like, we're not all gifted the same way and we don't all have the tools. If you tear your ACL, Matt, I got you. I'm going to hook you up. I'm going to fix you up. But those kind of intentional conversations are really hard. And if it's hard for me, then I know it's hard for a lot of other people. And I don't want people to feel, I think that heaped more guilt and shame. So in addition to understanding the decisions my kids were making or how to navigate that, I heaped more guilt because I didn't know how to effectively communicate with them. And so that would just be my petition to people: don't try to do this alone. And I tried to do it alone for a long time, and it was so difficult. And I'm so thankful that I've had the support from counseling and friends.
Well, I'm grateful for you and getting to know you just a little bit and through this process. Really appreciate your endorsement of therapy, because I do. I think it's so important, and I'm so grateful that you and Claire have connected. Claire is such a gift to Emerge. She's an amazing clinician, and I don't have a torn ACL. I do have a broken toe that I'm nursing. So I don't know if you can help me with that at some point. But Lori, really appreciate you. I've been looking forward to this podcast and sharing this, because I do think a lot of people are stuck in that hypothetical prison of guilt and shame. And so many are going through it. So really grateful for your just honesty and transparency and being able to talk about it, and allowing people to listen and go, you know what? if Lori's navigating this, maybe I can figure this out too.
Can I say one other thing, Matt?
Absolutely.
In kind of navigating this, in feeling God calling us to a different church that we had attended for 20 years, I kept telling my small group that, like, I'm Jonah, like, I don't want to go to Nineveh. I don't want to be a part of this. I felt God continuing to push me to help create a space for this. And so that is, he brought my husband and I to another church, and ironically, and it's all God, connected with somebody on staff who's in our same demographic, who's dealing with similar things. And we are kind of currently, planning to meet with church staff to figure out next steps for this. And so I would say that's the other thing, is don't just accept that this is the way things are. Be proactive. If you feel God's calling you, like I said, it was a tough decision, but I said, God's calling us somewhere else. And the way that God has navigated where we're at right now, I know that he's calling me and creating a space for us to help support other parents. I just know that that's what he's doing. And so if that's where you're at, if you're further along, but you feel like there's not that space, go to your pastoral staff and see how you can assist and be that. Because to your point, I get it. Like, you're right. They can't minister to all people. But if we can, as lay people, provide that platform, then do it.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Lori. Thank you so much for your time, and really grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Matt.
We all know parenting can be tough, especially with an adult child. It can feel isolating. It can stir up doubt, fear, even questions about your own faith and where things went wrong. But as we talked about today, the journey isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying anchored in love, truth, and hope. Lori, thank you for bringing so much honesty and wisdom into this space, this conversation that so many people need, even if they haven't had all the words for it yet. And to those of you who are listening, keep showing up, keep loving well, keep trusting that God is still at work, even in the parts of the story that you can't see yet. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who might need it. Sometimes the simplest act of passing along a conversation like this can remind someone they're not alone. Well, until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless. In a world where life can feel overwhelming, there's a place in the greater Northeast Ohio area where people find peace, hope, and healing. Emerge Counseling Ministries. For over 50 years, Emerge continues to be a trusted faith-based counseling center offering professional mental health care with a foundation in Christian values. Whether you're struggling with anxiety, depression, grief, or simply feeling stuck, our licensed counselors are here to walk alongside you. And the impact speaks for itself. 97% of our clients say they would recommend Emerge to a friend. 98% say they truly felt understood and heard by their counselor. And 84% report that their issue is improving through the care with us. At Emerge, you're not just a case number, you're a whole person. And we are here to support your journey towards healing and growth. It's confidential, compassionate, Christ-centered care. Learn more or schedule an appointment today at emerge.org. That's emerge.org. Remember, you don't have to walk alone.